A very warm welcome to the members, friends, and new listeners to the Global Justice Report, a new online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Betsy Bowman, and I'm your host for today's show. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational bilingual research center in San Miguel de Allende, Guanajuato, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world. Since 2004, we have offered educational programs in English for the local expat community and our many winter and summer visitors who return most years, not this year, unfortunately, to participate in our symposia. We also have educational programs in Spanish for the larger community here. Our vision is bold. It is no less than to move control of economic life and relations with Mother Earth from the 1% to the 99%. We know that there are about 1 million other small NGOs out there, lots of really big ones, who are also working in the same vein. And hopefully we can work towards a post-COVID world that will be habitable and viable for our children and our grandchildren. The coronavirus has, of course, set in relief the failures of neoliberal capitalism, and the recent state violence against unarmed Black men in the United States has underlined the systemic racism on which neoliberalism and US imperialism is built. Our weekly Global Justice Report will explore all kinds of alternatives that can be helpful in a post-COVID world. From grassroots democratic solutions such as self-management, cooperatives, mutual aid, and maybe most importantly, public banking. If you have suggestions for future webinars or for today's speaker, you can type them in on the right where there is a chat box. We're happy, we are honored to welcome today Tony Smith, Professor Emeritus from Iowa State University, one of the best Marxist commentators around today. He has just published a new book entitled Beyond Liberal Egalitarianism. Don't be scared by the name. It's about capital, as Piketty's book was, but it's much better and much more readable. Tony joins us from Minneapolis, where he has recently moved. Tony, welcome to our Global Justice Report for this week. Tony will speak on, will the zombie capitals die this time? Please welcome Tony.
Thank you very much, Betsy, and thanks to the Center for this invitation to talk this afternoon. I should mention that I'm just going to be talking about one part of our society and what's been going on. It's not the most pressing topic immediately. The most pressing topics today are to think about structural racism and to think about new forms of activism, the rise of the autonomous zones in different cities and so on. My talk is sort of the background from some of those things, but again, just one part of a very complex and complicated story. So I'll try to keep this to 40 minutes like Betsy asked me to do. And I'm trying to get this. Okay, here we go. I will get that like this. Okay, so what we're going to do today is talk about an interesting development in the business press the last couple of years. It has an echo of a Marxian idea, this concept of zombie capital. Try to talk a little bit about why zombie capitals have arisen at this particular point in time, and caught the business press's attention. And then I'm going to try to expand the concept of zombie capital beyond what we find in the business press, talk about a little bit of the contemporary crisis that we're in today and what the fate of the zombies might be. And then if there's time, talk about some alternative paths that we could be taking in the future. So I guess move the... All right, so the echo of Marx in the business press. So many of you probably know this phrase. It was certainly one of the most striking things when I first read Capital. Capital is dead labor that vampire-like only lives by sucking living labor and lives the more labor it sucks. Very striking, evocative passage where Marx says, literally, right, capital is a vampire that lives by sucking the blood of the living labor. Okay, well, zombie isn't quite the same as a vampire. Vampires live by off of blood. Zombies live by feeding on human brains, but close enough, right? Close enough. And so it's interesting that we find references increasingly in the business press to zombie capital as a category. So here's something from the Financial Times. Notice the date was before the COVID crisis hit. How to avoid a corporate zombie apocalypse. And so here's a quote from here. It's a reference to J.C. Penney. For several years, its profit has not been able to cover its debt. And usually this is when a business would be forced out of business. But this hasn't been the case for companies like J.C. Penney. They keep going. After a decade of central banks pushing liquidity into the global economy, there are a lot more of them, and they may be eating the brains of the corporate world. In a competitive market, the zombies would be at rest in their graves. Instead, they walk abroad, reanimated by cheap money. So that's the Financial Times. Here's an article from the Bank of International Settlement Quarterly Review, and you do not get more mainstream capitalist than the Bank of the International Settlement Quarterly Review. And they're publishing articles with titles like The Rise of Zombie Firms, where a key takeaway is the prevalence of zombie firms has ratcheted up since the late 1980s. This appears to be linked to reduced financial pressure, reflecting the effects of lower interest rates. And this article had a graph here. The red line is the percentage of companies that do not have earnings high enough to cover their debt, the interest they owe on their debt. And the blue line represents the probability that these companies that go through 1 year without being able to meet debt will keep going through a series of years and stay alive without being able to meet their debt. Specifically, this is the line of the number of companies that have gone 3 years without being able to have enough earnings to cover the interest on their debt. And so this is what the business press means by zombie companies. So now we want to ask, why do these graphs look like this, right? Why do the lines going up? Why is the slope so high? So we ask, what explains the emergence of zombie capitals in this sense? And they give us the answer, right? The Financial Times says these are companies reanimated by cheap money. The Bank from International Settlement article says this is linked to the reduced financial pressure, reflecting the effects of lower interest rates. Okay, but what's not explained is why has there been this explosion of credit money that has allowed these companies to survive? So in order to explain this, I'm going to go and talk a little bit about what we find in volume 3 of Capital, where Marx gives us sketches a theory of a pattern of capitalist development. This is not a very sophisticated slide, but it captures the basic idea. Marx sees capitalist development as basically beginning with some acceleration phase where some new area of capital investment opens up, a new technological revolution, something like that. There's a period of time where they can keep pumping money and making investments and getting high profits, put the profits back into the investment. And so they have a long extended upswing. At some point or other, the upswing peters out, loses steam. We enter into what he calls the overexertion phase. And then there's a period of downswing, decline, where the capital investment gets devalued, companies get liquidated. And I want to concentrate especially on this transition from upswings to downswings, because I think this is really important to understand what's going on today. In Marx's story, the upswing ends with, again, so much investment going into this new area that at some point there's excess productive capacity. Sometimes he talks about overproduction. Sometimes he talks about an overaccumulation crisis. It's basically there's now more productive capacity in the economy than the market can absorb. Now, when that happens, the banks still want to keep the game going. So they are happy to roll over the loans of the companies that have borrowed from them. They're happy to keep funding new pursuits that open up, new companies that come to them with ideas. They're happy to fund speculation that shows signs of making profits. And this is a period where fraud, Marx talks about how this is the period where fraud becomes very concentrated in the capitalist economy, even more than usual. And if they put in enough credit, it enters what Marx calls the overexertion phase of the cycle. At some point, however, though, the debt builds up so much that some random event will make the lenders, the banks, start to worry. They'll start to call in their loans instead of keep rolling them over. At that point, the borrowers need to come up with the money to start paying back those loans. In his day, of course, gold is the ultimate form of high-powered money, and what the banks demanded was hard currency, gold. So that sets off a stampede of these borrowers to liquidate their assets in order to obtain the gold. The more they try to sell the assets, the more they're selling into a declining market. The more the market for their assets declines, the more they have to try to sell. And at the end of the day, their liabilities have stayed high. The value of their assets has gone down. They have to declare bankruptcies on massive levels. There's unemployment on a massive level, and we go into an economic downswing. And so in Marx's account, capitalist development includes within it severe recessions and depressions. Now, if we look at what's happened in global capitalism since the 1970s, or since World War II, it basically fits this pattern for a long time. So we had the big upswing after World War II. There was all sorts of reason for capital investment because the world had to be rebuilt. Massive amounts of investment, high profits. The high profits justify reinvestment. We have a nice long upswing, a golden age, so to speak. But it ends as Marx predicted, and as Marxists at that time predicted, it ends in an overproduction crisis and excess, where there's excess productive capacity in all the major sectors of the world market after Europe and Japan have rebuilt. There's too much productive capacity in the steel sector, the auto sector, and so on and so on and so on. Just like in Marx's story, at this point, the upswing continues basically because of an expansion of credit money that's given by the banks to keep it going. Nobody wants to admit the golden age is over. But that at some point, the people who have been giving this credit don't want to keep giving it anymore. They start worrying that it's ever going to be repaid. They demand repayment. There's a big flight to get, again, hard currency, which again is gold. And at this point, massive amounts of gold start leaving Fort Knox and going outside the US borders. If this had continued, that would have been the end of the US period of hegemony in the world economy. And it would have set off a global depression probably in the 1970s. Now that didn't happen. And the basic reason it didn't happen is because the US economy broke from gold. And as the dominant economy, it was able to basically proclaim that the dollar was now going to be world money. The dollar is a pure fiat money. It can be created without limit in principle. And so in principle, that enables a lot more credit to be created by the banking system without having to worry about what caused the downswing in Marx's period, which is the rush away from credit into gold. That option is now taken away. Now there's two problems here that would prevent this from being the basic solution to the slowdown, the economic slowdown of the 1970s. The first one is that if you create enough credit in the economy, you have to worry about there being inflation breaking out. And of course, there was a big bout of inflation in the 1970s. The type of capitalism we call neoliberalism came up with the solution to that problem. And the solution is basically a war on labor. If you can create a massive amount of unemployment that brings wages down, if you can create a lot of capital flight from the unionized sectors, the high wage sectors to the low wage sectors, both within the United States and overseas, if you can start automating blue collar jobs, All those things are effective ways to prevent inflation from arising, because if prices go up, wages can't keep up with them. So they beat inflation through the war on labor. The second big problem here is that if you create a massive amount of credit, that's going to lead to a stock market bubble, right? Because people will borrow to invest in the stock market. As more people borrow to invest in the stock market, that's going to lead to higher prices. As the higher prices go up, people's wealth looks like it's been increased, so they can go and borrow more based on that increased wealth. They can take what they've borrowed more to invest it back in the stock market to push the price up, and you can get a speculative financial bubble. The Neil solution here is let it happen. As long as there's not generalized inflation, just don't worry about inflation of capital assets, financial assets. It will lead to the bubbles bursting, but then the neoliberal model figures out that if we could just have central banks that can keep pumping in money to save the financial sector, we can just keep going on and keep going on. So we have this long period here where the amount of debt in the global economy is relatively low at the end of the golden age period after World War II. And then beginning with this break from gold, it just goes up and up and up and up and up and up. All right, now this enables capital accumulation to avoid the global slowdown, to avoid the depression that a lot of people thought was going to happen in the 1970s. If you expand enough credit, you'll get more spending by consumers, by households, by firms, by governments, which can absorb more of the productive capacity. So less of it is excess, and now more can be used profitably. And you'll get an inflation of the value of financial assets through the mechanism I just described. In other words, you get a jump in profits. You can maintain profits in both the financial sector and the real economy. Because of those profits, that justifies putting more investment into financial assets, more investment into the real economy, including funding high-tech startups. If there's a yet more expansion of credit money, then you can get a further expansion of spending, absorb more productive capacity, build up the value of the financial assets, get more profits, get more investment. So basically, in the terms of volume 3 of Capital, we are in a different phase of capitalism than the one Marx described. Neoliberalism represents something new in the history of capitalism. What it represents is the ability of the capitalist state, basically through its central banks and the central bank's control over the banking system, to indefinitely extend that overexertion phase that Marx thought was a relatively brief phase before a severe recession or depression would kick in. Because of these things that we've talked about, that has not happened. There has not been a global depression. So that overexertion phase has just been able to continue a lot longer than Marx anticipated it ever could have continued. This has been of great use to the United States capitals in the neoliberal period. We've had expansions of unprecedented length with low inflation. The United States has been able to stay at the center of the global economy, both because of its control of global flows of finance capital, but also because its capitals are at the frontier of scientific and technical innovation. And also other countries have benefited too, especially China, which has enjoyed the most rapid economic growth in the history of, basically the history of the world, because of its symbiotic relationship with with neoliberalism in the United States. But the basic underlying problem has continued. And the underlying problem is there is still overproduction, there's still overaccumulation, there's still excess productive capacity in all the major sectors of the world market. The rise of China has exacerbated this problem. And that puts constraints on industrial capacity utilization. It puts constraints on investment levels. It puts constraints on growth levels. And here's just some figures that give a sense of that. So here's capacity utilization in the United States, which is basically a measure of how much excess productive capacity there is in the economy, how much capacity is not being used. And we can see the use of capacity during this period has been declining. which reflects, I think, excess productive capacity in the world economy as a whole. This is an interesting graph because the blue line shows the assets, the asset gains, which for our purposes can be taken as a proxy for financial assets, stock market, and so on. And we see the blue line for a long time, the red line represents investment by capital in the United States. So for the beginning of this period, the so-called golden age of capital, investment levels and levels of the stock market, financial assets more or less coincide. Beginning in the neoliberal period, we see divergence, and we see the stock market assets having these heights and investment levels a long-term level of decline. So there's quite a big gap today between the stock market value and the level of investment in the economy. So here's another way of talking about that. It takes more and more credit over time, the blue line that keeps going up, to keep there being some growth in GDP in the global economy. So over time, you get less and less bang for the buck. Over time, to get the same increment of growth in the global economy, it takes more and more and more debt. So here's another way to picture that. Over time, again, growth per unit of debt added is in the globe as a whole has been going down over this whole period. All right, so this is the answer to the question, I think, about why zombie capitals roam the planet today. With slow growth and higher debt, then for the least productive firms, their interest payments will inevitably begin to exceed their income. And the only way they can continue operating is if they can keep getting access to more and more rolled over debt, more and more cheap credit. And so these companies are in this funny status, right? They're neither alive in the sense that's relevant to capital, profitable, but nor are they dead. They're not forced out of business. So they're undead capitals. They're zombie capitals. All right, so that's the sense of the term that we find used in the business press. And what I want to talk about now is just step back and think about this metaphor a little bit. And again, I'm going to take vampires and zombies as more or less comparable to each other. So what was Marx's point when he started talking about how capital is a zombie? And I think it means, I think it comes down to what money, the role of money in capitalism. In a monetarized society, there's a sense in which it's literally the case that money is social life. Now, it's a form of social life that is alien from society. But Marx has this statement from the Grundrisse, one of the great, I think it's a very striking statement. Every individual carries his or her social power and his or her connection with society in their pocket. I think Marx meant that literally, right? Because what is money? Money is what gives you power over living labor. Money is what gives you social power in a capitalist society, the most monetarized society in human history. So a society that is set up to let these companies get access to unprecedented amounts of money, that's a society that has this zombie feature to it, right? In contemporary capitalism, otherwise insolvent companies are kept undead by devouring social life force in the alien form of money. And I wanted to give a little shout out to David McNally's book, which really makes this point very, very strongly and very well. All right, but if we take this concept of what it means, then it turns out the concept of zombie capital is broader, much broader than in the business press. In the business press, it simply means the companies where the interest payments on the debt that they have to make exceed the earnings coming in. But really, when you think about what the concept of zombie capital means, it's a much broader category that basically includes almost all capitals, because any capital might be a zombie capital in the sense that a capital that it's only avoided insolvency because of the explosion of credit money created by the banking system and under the direction of the state, under the direction of the central bank, right? Any unit of capital might have gone under without repeated massive and unprecedented infusions of social life in the alien form of money by banks. So basically, all capitals are zombie capitals in that sense of the term. Now, I want to expand the term in another direction as well. And now we're going to get to the classic sense of zombies, the things that need brains, need to eat brains in order to stay alive or stay undead. And there's a sense in which the most powerful companies in our world are not just zombie capitals in the sense that if it hadn't been for this tremendous infusion of credit money, they might not be here today. They're zombies in a third sense as well. And this goes back to Marx's concept of the general intellect, a concept he introduced in the Grundrisse. So the general intellect has a couple of different forms. First of all, one manifestation of the general intellect is our common collective cultural heritage, right? We're able to do what we can do today because of all the social gifts that previous societies have given us, the gifts of language, mathematics, scientific technical knowledge. Now, if we think about what contributes to creating wealth today, there's a tremendous contribution, unestimable contribution of collective cultural heritage is required to produce wealth today, right? Imagine what wealth we could produce today if we didn't know the mathematics given to us from the past, the science given to us from the past, if we didn't have the language that was a gift of previous societies. This is part of our collective heritage. And over time, the contribution of the past as a free gift to us in the present becomes a bigger portion of what is required in order to produce social wealth. Now, what intellectual property rights, it allows the companies that have them to appropriate privately the social wealth that is produced as a result of this common collective heritage that belongs to all of us. So in that sense, it's almost a literal sense. These are companies that live off eating the social brains, so to speak. And then there's the contribution not of the past, but of the national innovation system funded with public monies today that produces the knowledge that these companies then claim property rights to and then commercialize. Now this slide, it's very hard to see. And I'm sorry about that, but the basic idea is if we look at where the innovations come from, that companies like Amazon and Google and Facebook parasitically live off of, and it comes from it comes from the National Science Foundation, it comes from the National Institute of Health, especially Big Pharma fits under that. It comes under the Defense Department spending on innovation. It comes under the Small Business Innovation Research, NASA's contribution. The CIA puts in a lot of money. That's a CIA company. The point here is this wealth is created basically with public money. The big companies slap a patent on it and are able to claim it as their private possession. And so for me, that means there's a third sense of zombie capital in our society. And it basically refers to the very biggest, most successful capitals that there are. Okay, so much for that. And now on to the fourth section here, where we talk a little bit about where we are today and what's going to be the fate of these zombies. The first point to make here, this is what Betsy's going to talk about next week, and I could not agree with her thesis more. If we look at how things were before the COVID virus hit, we were just waiting for the next crisis to happen. The global economy in 2019 was no more sustainable than it was before the dot-com bubble burst or before the housing bubble burst. And there are all sorts of signs of that. One is the degree in which the stock market had become unhinged from reality. And this graph captures that pretty well. This is the gap between the valuation of companies in the S&P 500, the US stock market, and this is the level of profits before tax. And even before the big decline resulting from when the virus hit, we can see this gap just getting ridiculous, just getting absolutely ridiculous. So this wasn't going to last forever. If we looked at the level of debt in the global economy, in the US economy. If we looked at the number of zombie capitals that were out there, or potential zombie capitals, again, these numbers are hard to get your head around, right? The total global non-financial corporate debt, $74 trillion. Now, if we look at how the IMF evaluated the status of this debt in October 2019, again, before the virus, anybody knew what the virus was going to be, they estimated that if there were a slowdown that was just even half as bad as the financial crisis in 2008, just half as bad as that, $19 trillion of total corporate debt, nearly 40% of total corporate debt could go bad. Again, a staggering figure, and it just shows things weren't so great before the virus hit. So the virus then became the trigger, and what a trigger it was. This, of course, represents the loss of jobs. Again, these numbers are staggering. 20,687,000 jobs lost in the United States. 20 million, over 20 million jobs lost in 2 months. Now, 2 million of them came back, but that's a drop in the bucket. We can see the dive in consumption expenditure that followed from that. We can see the level of the decline of the US GDP this year relative to other recessions. I mean, certainly relative to what they call the Great Recession. It's anticipated it'll be over twice as bad as the Great Recession was. And as far as the globe goes, of course, this is not just a US story. And of course, if you're in the emerging economies, the decline is going to be even much worse. So what does the capitalist state do when something like this happens? It shifts into gear, and everybody forgets about libertarianism. Libertarianism is revealed for the bullshit it is. And the capitalist state jumps in to try to save as much of capital as it can, and that means save the zombies by trying to reestablish that overexertion period, keep the overexertion phase going a little bit longer through yet another infusion of money on even a more massive scale. This guy from the Atlantic thinks it's going to take $10 trillion just in the US to do that. The federal government has already spent $3 trillion in emergency spending on households and mostly businesses. The Federal Reserve Bank is doing everything it can. This is an interesting statement from The Economist. Never before have central banks created so much money in so little time. In just 3 months, America's monetary base has grown by $1.7 trillion. The Fed has told us it's going to keep interest rates close to zero for banks to borrow into the indefinite future. It's for the big allies in the United States, they can basically get as many dollars as they need to prop up their financial sector. The gross government debt is going to hit the roof by all historical measures. It's anticipated that the US government is going to go into greater debt to prop up the capitalist economy this year than it went into to fight World War II as a percentage of GDP. So that's how much the capitalist state is going to try to come to the rescue here. And this is an interesting graph too, because it represents the measure of government stimulus today relative to what it was in the Great Recession of 2008, which is the smallest circle. And you can see the greater scale of capitalist state intervention to try to keep the capitalist economy going in the present crisis. And it's worked. If what you care about is the stock market, it's worked. So if you look at the ratio between the value in the stock market relative to the earnings of US companies, the value today relative to earnings is basically as ridiculously high as it was at the height of the dot-com bubble, which was the previous historical high. Well, we're getting rapidly approaching to that. So that's a success from the standpoint of the Federal Reserve. But the bottom line is the economy as a whole, they can prop up the stock market, but they can't instantaneously overcome a recession that's this deep. So the Congressional Budget Office thinks it's going to take till 2030 to get the US economy back to where it was in 2019. Who knows if that's right or not, but that's their projection at least. So to go back to the question of what's the fate of the zombies today, a lot of those zombie ones where their interest payments that are required are higher than their earnings, they're not going to make it. They're not going to make it. So this guy from NYU, he's done the most extensive study I know about, and he predicts that at least 165 large firms in the U.S. that's with over $100 million of debt are going to go bankrupt by the end of the year. Okay, so a lot of the zombies in that first sense are going to go out of business and they'll die. But there's going to be a new, fresh batch of zombies because the Fed has made so much credit available to companies so cheaply. In the first couple of months of this year, this I think goes up until the beginning of May, companies in the United States have borrowed as much already this year as they borrowed all of last year. So again, that's good in the short term for them, but in the long term, because the economy is going to come back so relatively slowly, because the decline was so steep, their earnings are going to be so great. So it's pretty much inevitable that the number of firms where the interest payments on their debt that they require to be paid back are going to be greater than the earnings that they're getting. They're borrowing so much now that makes it almost inevitable there are going to be even more zombies in that first sense tomorrow. Of course, in the second sense of zombies, again, the entire economy are zombies in that second sense, because they're capitals that could very well have died if it weren't for that massive and unprecedented infusion of social life in the alien form of money that's going on now. As far as zombies in that third sense, the ones that eat the brains, the ones that are the high-tech companies, the most profitable ones, the giants, their fate looks pretty good. They are now in a situation of unprecedented corporate power. The big five tech giants have $560 billion just basically lying around for them to use and buy up other companies. And so they've started to go around buying up other companies. For instance, Facebook bought up a $5.7 billion stake in an Indian telecom. They have a ton of money lying around thanks to the Trump tax break. This graph didn't come out so well, but again, it shows some of the numbers here. If we just look at Apple, which has $207 billion of cash lying around to buy up any company it wants to buy up, that's greater than the stimulus program of most countries that Amazon has waiting to buy up other companies with. Now I ran out of my 40 minutes here, so I wanted to talk about alternatives at the very end. I'll be very compressed here. If we get beyond the nightmare of Trump, what I predict is going to happen is going to be a bipartisan future agenda to set up something like a national advanced industry strategy. We've seen Marco Rubio already try to position himself to do this. They're going to realize that the U.S. economy it's going to take a long time to get growth back. So to push the process along, I think there may be a post-Trump Republicans that are willing to use the government to support the economy more than they've been willing to do in the past. They'll tell themselves that this is okay because they can then compete more aggressively with China economically and militarily if we keep our high tech going. And they may even support a capital gains tax in order to get companies to spend a little bit less on stock buybacks and a little bit more on R&D. And I think they'll get Biden Democrats to go along with that because it might help inequality go down a little bit, and some of that might end up with some R&D going for green technologies, which would be good. But the problem, of course, is if we just focus on trying to build up the innovative capacity of our leading companies, which I think is what is most likely to happen as a way of dealing with the crisis in the immediate period. it's going to leave a social world where there's going to be greater unemployment. In the post-COVID world, I think automation levels are going to go up. Those who work outside the home are going to be exposed to higher levels of risk, at least until there's an effective vaccine. The continued extreme economic and political inequality is going to continue as those tech giants get even more corporate power and political power. There's going to be a greater threat of political authoritarianism. As the inequality continues, people are going to get more and more upset, and the authoritarian option is going to remain in the background. Trump, we can get rid of Trump, but what he represents is not going to go away. And we'll be creating a global world of neo-imperialism, because even if the United States can stay at the scientific and technological frontier, that will give competitive advantage in the global market to our leading companies. Okay, but what about all the companies, all the countries, all the regions of the world that can't pump in public money to support their leading companies? They look going to get destroyed in the world market. And that's a type of neo-imperialism. It'll be a recipe for continued Cold War with China. And sooner or later, again, I think it's inevitable. If we think about how much money is going in to build up the stock market today, again, unprecedented levels, sooner or later, there's going to be another financial crisis that will lead to an even bigger bailout. So I think basically, our choice is just to go along with that, or we have to take this different path and stop the undead from devouring the living. And that means just changing the whole rules of the game, right? Under capitalism, what capital is all about is being parasitically living off the commons. One form of the commons is the social power, the social life that is in the alien form of money. Without constantly giving the social life to companies in the form of these bailouts, they would die. Without constant public funding of innovation, they would not develop the innovations that capitals need to commodify and monetize. And again, they would die. So let's stop socializing. Let's stop having socialization of these costs for capital while they privatize the returns. And let's come up with a different concept of a commons that works for people. Other talks in this series are going to talk more in detail about this, but this would involve no more bailouts of capitalist investors. If capitals want to be bailed out, we will bail out firms on the condition they transform themselves into worker self-management enterprises. There's a financial sector that constantly requires bailing out. Well, we will bail out any bank that is transformed into a community bank that will support worker enterprises. And then we have to set up new democratic mechanisms to define what public needs are and to make sure that the investment going from community banks into worker enterprises responds to social needs and the priority of social needs. And all of that goes back to this old slogan. This comes from the autonomous zone here in Minneapolis. That is a couple of blocks that have been taken over by people as a memorial to George Floyd. And this is just one of the many inspiring artworks out there about that. And that's what it's all about. And so it's basically the alternative path is to keep the zombies. One path is to keep the zombie capitals alive to the end of time. And the other path is this path. And there just aren't any other alternatives that I can see. Okay, well, I've gone a little bit over, so thank you very much for your attention. And anyway, let's see what happens now.
Thank you very much, Tony, for an absolutely fascinating talk about what is behind what is going on in the economy that we don't see. And that we see the unemployment rising to 25 million. We see the increasing levels of household debt. I think that household debt today is in the trillions of dollars, whereas in 2008, it was $800 billion. Households being in that much debt are not going to be able to easily climb out from the massive crisis that we're in right now. I read in the business press that zombie corporations employ 2 million people. Is that, does this mean that there'll be another 2 million people who are unemployed? And then, of course, the cascading effect of bankruptcies to other companies is going to mean far greater unemployment.
Yes, to both questions, for sure. The 2 million figure seems low to me. If it turns out that the projection is that that this downturn could lead to 40% of the corporate loans going bad, I think it could end up being a lot more than 2 million. We will see. The cascading effects are certainly true, and that's why I think we have to expand the concept of zombie capitals. Right? There are the zombie capitals that will go under. But they would set off a spiral. This is part of what Marx talked about. When some firms go under because of excess debt, that sets off a cascade that other firms can't meet their payments, that other firms lose demand, and firms that had been solvent before become insolvent. So again, the second concept of zombie capital is the companies that can continue operating, but they would have gone bankrupt because of these cascading effects that you're talking about, if it hadn't been for this even greater infusions of debt and credit money into the economy. So I think all of these things are very important to keep in mind as the background, for sure. Yeah, so when people talk about the recovery and so on, you just have to always think about, what does that mean, right? If the recovery comes at a yet even higher levels of debt in the global economy, while the earnings are just being maintained, then that means the recovery means that more and more capitals become precarious. More and more capitals become zombies in that first sense. And my guess is that's the shape it's going to take.
So
I think at some point, capital can't put off a global depression. I think that's really the bottom line here, right? That we're in a very exceptional period in the history of capitalism, because when Marx wrote, capitalism had global depressions, from its start, and then it figured out this trick, right? This trick to avoid it. By, again, getting rid of gold, getting rid of commodity money, having all money be fiat money, credit money. And that gave it this long 40-year period where basically a depression that should have happened in the 70s gets put off. But it requires ever more debt to keep putting it off, ever more credit to keep putting it off. And it's getting ever less growth out of that increase in credit. And at some point or other, I think it won't be able to do it anymore. And that's when the political authoritarian option that capital keeps in the background and that Trump sort of is prefiguring may really kick in. So okay, something's going weird technologically here. Can you still hear me? Your screen is frozen on me.
can I say something? Say. We have some problems here with the transmission, but I was wondering, Tony, with so much unemployment, would that perhaps provide the background for the idea of a universal basic income, so that people can have some kind of income to live on? Otherwise, we're looking at mass unemployment, mass starvation, mass social unrest, mass repression. Do you see any possibility of a universal basic income being adopted? And could self-management or cooperatives be a way to keep these businesses going, businesses that face bankruptcy? Michael Hudson says that the debts are going to have to be wiped out to avoid a global depression. If some debts were wiped out, at least from small and medium businesses, could they be taken over then by their workforce? So there's two questions, one about a universal basic income, and then another about eliminating debts and workforces taking over their businesses as self-managed cooperatives.
Well, yeah, I mean, all these things depend on social struggles and the balance of power and the competing groups, of course. I think capital is going to try to resist a universal basic income.
Tony?
Yeah? Can you hear me?
He's not there.
Have I been lost? Am I lost in cyberspace? Anybody there? Well, if I could sing, I'd do some music now while we wait. Well, just in case anybody can hear, I think capital is going to resist universal basic income pretty fiercely. If something like that, they would agree to it, it would be on a very, very low level. I think we got to remember that the capital wage labor relationship is based on structural coercion, that you're forced to work, give up your living labor to capital in return for a wage. Okay, are you back? I can see you now.
Yeah.
Very, very low level. All right. Okay, now I can hear echoes of myself. Okay, there we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so anyway, sorry for all that. All right, so the short answer would be, I think it will all depend on basic struggle regarding both of those issues. I think there's going to be big factions of capital that hate the very idea of universal basic income, because the whole principle of capitalism is the structural coercion in the capital wage labor relationship. Why would you spend most of your adult waking life working for somebody else to make somebody else rich unless you had to? So the principle of a universal basic income lessens or removes, if it's at some level that would let people live some sort of decent life, it would remove the structural coercion behind the capital and wage labor relation. And I don't think that's compatible with capitalism. I think if they did agree to a universal basic income, it would be at a pathetically low level and would basically be enough to keep people out of starvation, maybe, for the sake of control political unrest, the absolute minimum that could dampen some political unrest. But it's certainly not going to be a universal basic income at a decent standard of living. I do not think that's possible in capitalism. And a similar point about the worker co-op, I think a worker co-op system as an answer to the problem requires, again, continual support by community banks that are philosophically committed to worker co-ops. And I don't think that's the capitalist global financial system is set up that way. I don't think they have any interest at all in helping set up thriving worker collectives, worker cooperatives. I think a couple of isolated cases maybe that, on local levels, they may adopt that. But in terms of a system-wide solution to the problems of capitalism, I don't see the capitalist financial system adopting worker co-ops as a way out. Now, the idea of a Jubilee year where there's massive forgiveness of debt, I think that might be another, I mean, there's something rational about that. But the problem is, again, somebody's going to have to pay the price of that, right? So who is going to absorb the massive debt that gets written off? So we're going to have the capitalist state absorb all these bad debts. Okay, that's one option, but the problem is for capital that politicizes money, and it sort of takes away the idea that the economy is a private economy, and creates the idea, which is the reality, that the capitalism could not continue a function without the state constantly coming to its rescue. So if the capitalist state just absorbed all these bad debts, then the question is going to inevitably arise. Well, if the system requires this public action to maintain itself, how come public priorities have such low place in the system? How come the future direction of the economy is left in the hands of Facebook and Google and Amazon instead of the public that is clearly now, unequivocally clearly, responsible for keeping the economy going? So I think, I think in principle, it's a way it could keep going. But again, ideologically, it's going to resist that. And so even if it's in the rational self-interest of capital to do that, it may not do it because the ideological reasons against it are so strong. And maybe there's something rational about not doing it because again, it changes the whole discussion. And it makes the sort of things we want to talk about later, like community planning and so on, much more realistic than capital wants them to be. Okay, I've lost your sound, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Tony.
Okay.
I'm one listener has asked, won't the value of the dollar crash in these circumstances that you're talking about? And what should be done about the crash of the US dollar?
Yeah, again, it's hard. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball. Nobody has a crystal ball. But it's amazing to me how many times it seems like the dollar's value should crash and it hasn't crashed. And the thing is that it's all relative, right? It's all relative. And it's still the case that, in a way, global crises are a way of maintaining the high value of the dollar because it remains the safest currency that's out there. And as long as we don't go back to gold or some other form of commodity money that other countries have access to, control over the dollar, it allows the U.S. to continue the role. I mean, it's going to take a lot to get the dollar out of that status of world money, of being world money. It probably will take a revolution in the United States to do it. I mean, we saw the graph about the crisis is hitting, it's a global crisis and it's hitting other parts of the world even worse than the United States in some ways. So getting access to world money is going to be still a pretty important thing for countries to do. And so as long as that's the case, I don't think there's going to be some utter, complete, final collapse of the value of the dollar anytime soon. But time will tell, as always. I don't think the Chinese currency is going to take over the status of the dominant form of world money. I think the Chinese government's too smart to want to do that. I don't think synthetic forms of money are going to take over from the dollar. We'll see. You've frozen on me again. We'll see. You've frozen on me again.
Well, that's very, I suppose, reassuring, but
can you see me and hear me?
What
You're
is going
frozen on my
to,
screen.
how is all of this debt going to be unwound? Are we going to end up as, like at the end of the fall of the Roman Empire, as, you know, debt and debt peonage? You know, most people are, household debt is over $13 trillion just in the United States. That's a huge amount of debt. How are people going to be able to continue to have an organized society and reproduce society? And how are people going to be able to continue living with that kind of, that level of debt?
Well, again, who knows? We are in an unprecedented period here, right? This is all new. There aren't really good historical analogies for debt on this level in capitalism so far. So we will see, but in principle, I don't think there's any final crisis in capitalism. There's no reason there's no magic number at which it's too much and it all topples down. There may be some tipping point that makes it all collapse once and for all, and that no amount of central bank aid can come to the rescue. No amount of fiscal spending by the state can come to the rescue. And then it's going to end in a global depression. And then it's going to turn out that we have avoided a global recession and global depression for decades and decades and decades and decades, only at the cost of making the global depression be so much more horrifically worse than any global depression before in the history of capitalism. I think that could easily happen. That could happen. It's not inevitable. Seems to me those are the three options, right? Either there's some sort of major structural change that brings about this. We just refuse to bail out capitals and instead pump the trillions of dollars into community banks that start funding co-ops. That's option one. Option two is we have these downswings and there's just ever more debt keeps the game going, and it just keeps going and keep going and keep going, and maybe that'll happen. And option three is there's some global depression that wipes out all the debt, and we just but again, capitalism will just keep going at that point from a lower level and start rebuilding if there's no political move to change it. So those are the three options, and I don't know which one of them will happen. I obviously hope for the first. Time will tell. You're back. I've got you back here. Welcome back.
Our listeners can ask questions of Tony by writing into the chat section on the right of their screen. Another person has written in and asked, historically, war has been a cure for depression. Do you think the US people would go for that solution again? It's sometimes when I'm really depressed, it looks like Trump might have a war against Iran just to keep the economy going, to keep his presidency going. And war has solved problems in the past, economic problems.
Yeah, yeah. I mean that's certainly true. I mean there was a competition for dominance in the world market between the United States and Germany in the beginning of the 20th century, and it took 2 world wars to resolve that conflict, and for the U.S. to grab the center stage. And so yes, in the past that's worked. Now there are 2 different questions maybe. I mean I think it is certainly possible Trump could have a war here because America tends to re-elect presidents during wartime, no matter how bogus and horrible the war is. So he might do that, but I don't think war is going to be a solution to global capitalism this time, because the scale of the destruction that any war that would be enough to, I mean, the problem is this excess productive capacity, right? The problem is there is still just too many companies competing in the same markets. And now there's all these Chinese companies And so we're having this big, the U.S. Sort of, I think there's going to be a tremendous bipartisan support, right, to defend U.S. capitals in this global competition against Chinese firms, because it's the case that there's too much productive capacity in the global market. And that's not good for capitalism. And so you can keep the game going by adding debt, but for reasons we've talked about, at some point that becomes a mess. But the other way you deal with the problem is just by destroying enough of the excess productive capacity. And then you can go back and hopefully at the end of that, get another golden age going. But the problem is just the destruction that would be required to remove all the excess productive capacity in the global economy would make the destruction of previous world wars look like child's play. So it would be truly madness. It would be truly madness. If that's the way forward for capital, then God help us all, right? And maybe that is the way forward for capital, and maybe they will do it at some point. But again, Rosa Luxemburg's famous statement, right? Socialism or barbarism. I mean, that would be the utter form of barbarism, to rely on another world war to respond to capital's problem. If people are willing to consider that, but not willing to consider the socialist alternative, then we're pretty much doomed.
Well, I hope that people do consider the socialist alternative. And I think in some ways, I feel hopeful now with all of the demonstrations around the world, not just in the United States, but around the world. People are demonstrating that they're fed up with the system. They're fed up with the endemic racism and the exclusion of so much of the world's population from the few who actually get to consume. It's preposterous to talk about overcapacity when half of the world is starving. We say that the United States is the wealthiest country on the planet, but half of the people live in or near poverty, and yet there's a problem of overcapacity, overproduction. But the needs of people around the world are just staggering. Um, of course, their need is not met with effective demand. They don't have money to buy things.
Yeah.
But if the choice is between socialism and war, are the rulers going to push us into war to save capitalism?
Who knows? I mean, lots of times these things happen by accident, right? They don't intend that, and they do 10 things that make it inevitable. Going back to your other point, I think anytime anybody talks about supply and demand and capitalist markets working by supply and demand, we should instantly shut them down, instantly interrupt. The only thing that matters in capitalism is effective demand, like you say, demand with purchasing power behind it. It is indeed completely irrational to be talking about structural problems of too much productive capacity where there's so much social need in the world. That is certainly a horrible indictment of capitalism. You mentioned the racism before, so I'd like to just quickly say, one of the things that has kept the system going and put off the Depression has been this war on labor that allowed there to be this incredible creation of credit without having to worry about inflation because wages have been kept so artificially low. We should take this is the moment to just acknowledge the disproportionate effect that has had on the Black community. So if we go back to the 1973, in 1973, before this happened, 80% of Black males were part of the U.S. labor force, and then in 2019, that had gone down to 63%. Because there was a tremendous amount of automation of the blue collar jobs that Black workers in the industrial northern states had, and a tremendous capital flight from those regions to the Southwest and then overseas. So the economic basis of the Black community, which wasn't so great in the golden age, but it was, at least they had built something that then neoliberalism has dismantled to a large extent. And so that's part of this story too, that we should certainly make explicit now, and should always be making explicit. Yeah, in terms of the effect of the slowdown today, one figure I noticed is worth mentioning too. If we look at the top fifth of jobs in terms of wages, employment levels for the top fifth of jobs in terms of wages has declined by 9% in the crisis. But if we look at the bottom fifth, where again, there's the disproportionate concentration of Black workers, the unemployment has increased by 35%. The decline of jobs has been by 35%. So the unemployment is concentrated in the most vulnerable sections of the population. So again, the contrast between the success of the Federal Reserve Bank at restoring the stock market, unbelievable success, versus the incapacity of dealing with that bottom fifth of workers, 35% of whom are unemployed, have been made unemployed by the virus. Only 3% of the stimulus program went to support the unemployed. So again, this is your point about priorities, right? What are the priorities of our political system? And the priorities are to keep the zombie capitals alive. And if that means, some money gets pumped into the unemployed, but basically the lost income to the unemployed, the stimulus program covered about half of it, and about half has just been lost. And we should remember, the worst is to come. The stimulus for unemployment, the extension of unemployment benefits, ends July 31st. And there's all sorts of signs Republicans aren't going to go along with extending it any further. So however great the cost has been on the most vulnerable section of the population, and specifically the Black community, by the downswing now, after July 31st, it's going to get much, 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 much worse. So there's reasons to be optimistic, and then certainly the numbers of autonomous zones. What a wonderful thing to see people proclaiming autonomous zones in our cities. I mean, this is what you dream about. But there's an awful lot to be worried about. I think it's going to get very, very brutal, very, 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 very fast. And the big struggles are still all ahead of us.
I am afraid that you're right. In a rational world, a universal basic income, workers taking over their businesses that have gone bankrupt because management took on so much debt that the businesses are no longer able to make a profit. In a rational world, there are solutions. In a rational world, we have solutions to the ecological crisis. We have solutions to the crisis of our democracy. The fact that elections are never you're never sure if they're really fair. The crisis in, well, the fact that politicians don't do what people want them to do. The threefold crisis which I talked about 10 years ago: economic, ecological, and political. There are all rational solutions to these problems, and we have the solutions to these problems, and yet they're not put into effect. And it's hopeful that so many people are in the streets, and that so many people are aware of the deeply rooted problems, and also that there are solutions, but of course they're not adopted by the people who have the power to adopt them. And we can just hope that if all of the million or so little NGOs around the world who are fighting for a better world can exert enough pressure on on their governments around the world that it be a better solution than more of the same. Because it's not going to be more of the same, it's going to be more of the same, but far worse.
Yeah. More brutal.
And that is something that no one wants, except, of course, for those who have everything. Well, I'm looking for more questions from our audience. I'm wondering how many people have gotten their $1,200 from the federal government living here in Mexico. It's amazing how few of the USians who live in Mexico have gotten their $1,200 from the government. We keep asking each other. Um, if you'd like to write in and respond to my question, and if you would like to, if you are interested in hearing more solutions discussed and debated on the Global Justice Report, please tune in next week. Next week, I'll be talking about the economic crisis from a less theoretical perspective and focusing more on the amount of debt. Can you borrow your way out of debt? Which seems to be the strategy that is being used. We at the Center for Global Justice have had to end all of our revenue raising programs. We've had to cancel them because of the coronavirus. However, we're still paying our Mexican staff. So if you enjoyed today's program, and I thank you so much, Tony, for presenting all of this. And I've been reading myself about zombie capitals in the press and wondering, oh my goodness, what's that? And I thank you so much for discussing this. And as much as nobody likes bad news, we really have to understand how serious the situation is and what we're facing. You can never solve a problem that you don't face. We'll shortly be facing the problem of running out of funds for our staff. So if you can make a donation, please do. Next week, I'll be talking more about the economic crisis, the third in just 20 years since the beginning of the 21st century. In 2 weeks, Jeff Foe, the founder and senior researcher at the Economic Policy Institute, will be speaking on can the Democrats save us from fascism? And on the 6th of July, Leo Panich will be joining us, and he'll be speaking on capitalism, socialism, and the pandemic. So thank you so much, Tony. I apologize for the technical glitches we've had, but these things happen. Technology is never perfect. Thank you so much, Tony. And please keep us posted as to what's happening in your hometown of Minneapolis. And we look forward to seeing you here in San Miguel one of these years when the pandemic is over. And we thank our members and friends and new listeners for joining us today. And please join us again next Monday at the same time. All of these talks are recorded and you can watch them later if you would like. Thank you very much. And thank you, Tony.